Hello and welcome back for the last lecture of the semester. Today we will consider the historical causes of the new terrorism that has come to dominate Middle Eastern politics and the United States foreign policy in the last few years. We will analyze the emergence of virulent conflict in the post-colonial Middle East, concentrating on its most prominent causes. These include, first, the birth of Israel just after World War II, which placed a Jewish nation in the middle of a Muslim-dominated region. Second, the growing international demand for petroleum, which has in the last half-century brought great riches to the Middle East, without necessarily, though, improving the region's infrastructure or the largely poor Muslim population's status. Lastly, we will consider the impact of the recent emergence of radical Muslim revivalism, which has resulted in the formation of radical Muslim organizations such as Al-Qaeda that are set on eliminating Western influence in the Middle Eastern Muslim societies by whatever means necessary. With Al-Qaeda, we have seen the rise of a new phase of terrorism in the modern world that resulted, among others, in the attack of September 11th. The United States' reaction to the terrorist attacks in 2001 responds to the new unilateralism that has characterized U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. It has very much changed the dynamic in the Middle East, bringing increasing numbers of disgruntled Muslims under the influence of the revivalists and the terrorists, further complicating the situation of this oil-rich but stability-poor region of the world. The Middle East crisis has its origins in the end of the Cold War in 1991. The end of capitalist-communist confrontation put an end to the bipolar division of world politics. The same was true in the Middle East, as bipolarism was replaced by unipolarism, with the United States as the only superpower. However, the hegemony of the U.S. was soon challenged by the growing influence of the European Union, and especially in the Middle East of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, an allegiance of petroleum-producing countries, mainly Middle Eastern, founded during the Cold War to challenge U.S., European, and Soviet oil price regulation. Starting in the 1970s, OPEC drove petroleum prices up, well aware of the increasing demand for the precious resource. When the Cold War ended and U.S. and Soviet funding in the Middle East dried up, oil revenues became all the more critical in the region. Oil has been both a blessing and a curse for the Middle East. A blessing because it has brought much-needed money to the region. A curse because oil production has brought with it outside interference in local affairs. The political and economic developments in the Middle East are carefully monitored and, in many cases, manipulated by oil-consuming nations such as the U.S., Russia, Europe, and China, concerned with protecting their oil supply. Oil drilling has also been a curse because the great piles of money have done little really to improve the economic situation of a great majority of the Middle Eastern population. Most of the money earned from the sale of oil ends up in the pockets of the long-established royal dynasties. The sheiks have become extremely rich while their countries remain largely underdeveloped and retrograde. In addition, there are a few neighbors in the Middle East that do not, in fact, have petroleum. These oil-poor Arab nations remain even less developed than their oil-rich neighbors, causing inequalities and tensions. Arab nations in the Middle East have resisted outside influences in various ways. Nationalism has helped strengthen individual countries, but it has done little to unite the larger group of Arab nations in the area. In the 1950s and 60s, a new movement called Pan-Arabism emerged, which attempted to unite the nations of the Middle East by building a stronger sense of Arab identity. This Pan-Arabism transgressed national boundaries to unite Arabs against common enemies. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the head of the Egyptian government during this period, was heavily influenced by these ideas, and soon became the leading Pan-Arabist in the region. His version of Pan-Arabism centered on the rejection of foreign political and economic influences, much in the same way as anti-neo-colonial nationalism in Latin America rejected U.S. intervention in the American continent. In 1954, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which is built on Egyptian soil but which was controlled by the French and British. This move ensured that profits from the canal remained in Egypt. He followed this by the formation in 1958 of the United Arab Republic, which included Egypt and Syria. Nasser had hoped that the new Arab Republic would attract other Arab nations and grow to be the prominent force in Middle Eastern politics. However, disagreements with Syria soon ended the Pan-Arabic dream. The United Arab Republic lasted only 3 years. Yet, even though Pan-Arabism failed to draw Arab nations together, the foundation of Israel as a nation in 1948 succeeded in uniting Arab nations against the new Jewish state. The imposition of the United Nations of a new Jewish nation in the midst of the mainly Arab-Muslim area of Palestine caused great frustration among Arab nations and reflected, for many, the dominant influence of outside interests in the Middle East. The elimination of Israel soon became the center of Pan-Arabic objectives. On 3 different occasions, in 1948, in 1967, and again in 1973, Arab nations united to fight against Israel. However, each time, Israel succeeded in beating back Arab aggression. The Israeli military proved to be quite strong and resilient. Another reason for the success of Arab defeats was the lack of coordination between Arab nations in their attacks against Israel. As united as the Arab nations were against the idea of Israel, they proved to be disunited in their planning and execution of war plans. This lack of operational unity reflected a deeper division that existed between Arab nations and helps to explain why Pan-Arabism ultimately failed. Yet Israel remained, and its expansion during the Arab-Israeli wars had brought even more Palestinian land under its control. Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation took a violent turn in the 1970s with the creation of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, who you see here on the left. The PLO employed guerrilla tactics against the Israeli army and civilians. They also used terrorist tactics, including bombings, assassinations, and airplane hijackings. You might not remember, but in the 1970s and 80s, many airliners were hijacked by Arab militants with the intention of exchanging the passengers they had taken prisoner for the release of imprisoned Arab and Palestinian militants. Though many passengers died in these hijackings, this form of terrorism rarely had the effect the Arab militants desired, mainly because Israel and the United States, among other nations, refused to negotiate with hijackers. By the end of the 1980s, this type of terrorism had all but died down. At about the same time, however, there arose a new movement to resist Western influences in the Middle East. It emerged in Iran in the form of religious revivalism, or as it's also often called, religious fundamentalism, a movement which called for the return to the foundations of Muslim religion. Its most visible leader was the man you see on the right, Ayatollah Khomeini, an Iranian cleric who extolled the virtues of Muslim religious piety and tradition. By extension, he rejected what he considered the negative modernizing influences of Western countries. In 1979, Khomeini's words inspired a popular revolution against the U.S.-influenced Iranian government, replacing it with a religious government which Khomeini led as supreme religious and political leader. That same year, Iranian college students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the Iranian capital, capturing and holding 63 U.S. citizens for 444 days. The hostage crisis helped cement the Khomeini-led religious regime in Iran. In many ways, Khomeini's rejection of the modern and glorification of the traditional was a reaction against the increasing economic and political dominance of capitalist Western countries in the Middle East. Yet this rejection of the modern was somewhat paradoxical. The traditional society Khomeini and the Muslim revivalists looked back to for inspiration was the period 300 or 400 years earlier when Arab nations had been quite dominant in world affairs. Yet their dominance was based on strong military and economic power, which was in turn dependent on the use of the modern technological advances of the day. The Arab nations of that period had not rejected modernity, quite the opposite. They had embraced it and utilized it to strengthen their empires. Although the Iranian Revolution remained largely isolated in the Middle East, its neighbors were forced to accept, at least in part, the religious revivalism proposed by Khomeini's regime. Saudi Arabia, for many years a close ally of the United States, has in the last 20 years allowed and even encouraged religious revivalism. The country is ruled by a royal family and has close dealings with the U.S. both elements vehemently opposed by Khomeini and the Iranian revivalists. However, the Saudi rulers have allowed moderate revivalism in an attempt to stem a religious revolution such as the one that overtook Iran in 1979. The strongest influence of the Iranian Revolution has been in encouraging the foundation of smaller revivalist groups such as Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. Hezbollah has established itself as a dominant influence in Lebanon, north of Israel, from where it has recently carried out guerrilla actions against Israel. For example, the fighting in Lebanon in the summer of 2006 was between Hezbollah and Israeli forces. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, has taken on a much larger enemy, the U.S. Strongly influenced by Iranian religious revivalism, Al-Qaeda and its most visible leader, Osama bin Laden, issued a fatwa, or religious edict, declaring a jihad, or religious war, on the West and Israel in 1998. In it, one can identify the resistance to modernization and Western dominance I described earlier. The Fatwa declaration was soon followed by a series of concerted attacks on U.S. possessions abroad. That same year, Al-Qaeda bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, killing some 300 people. Al-Qaeda was also responsible for the bombing 2 years later of the USS Cole, an American destroyer anchored in Yemen. However, the most infamous Al-Qaeda terrorist attack was that carried out on September 11, 2001, against the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which claimed the lives of almost 3,000 people. The U.S. reaction to the September 11th attacks have included the invasion in 2001 of Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were centered, and in 2003 of Iraq, a country dominated not by Muslim religious revivalism, but rather by Saddam Hussein, a secular dictator that had until 1991 been an ally of the United States. The invasion of Iraq was especially controversial because the U.S. government's justification for the operation, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that could be used against the U.S., and that Saddam had connections with Al-Qaeda and actively subsidized them. Neither turned out to be true. The invasion was also controversial because the U.S. government, led by President George Bush, ignored international opinion, including that of the United Nations, which was against the invasion. The main architects of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney, insisted the operation was nevertheless justified because establishing a democratic regime in Iraq would set up a beacon of secular democracy and respect for human rights in the Middle East, an example that other countries in the region could follow, eventually leading to a modern, democratic, and U.S.-friendly Middle East. However, the war in Iraq has resulted in quite the opposite. Rather than increase the support for the U.S. and Western political values, the war has fomented greater rejection of the U.S., encouraging more and more young men to join the ranks of insurgent groups, some of them with links to Al-Qaeda, that resist the U.S. occupation in Iraq. Al-Qaeda itself, rather than diminish in size, has grown rapidly, with new supporters arising from across the Muslim world. Traditional Middle Eastern allies of the U.S., such as Saudi Arabia, have distanced themselves, at least publicly, from U.S. policies to avoid popular unrest in their countries. It is difficult to find a solution to the Iraqi conflict. The violence and death that accompanies the U.S. invasion and occupation, as well as the continued political instability of Iraq, have effectively alienated great numbers of Iraqis, many of whom doubt democracy can succeed in their country. Furthermore, the U.S. international image has suffered greatly. Only a handful of countries continue to support its foreign policy. Even worse, public opinion in the U.S. has turned against the government's commitment to the war. The images of more and more servicemen coming back to the U.S. in caskets with no apparent end to the war in sight has turned most of the U.S. population against its own government, much as it did during the Vietnam War over 30 years ago. Perhaps if the U.S. government leaves behind its unilateral approach to foreign policy by including other interested parties, including perhaps Middle Eastern countries, in the negotiation of a solution to the conflict in Iraq, a resolution might be reached. This, however, will be a difficult and lengthy process. Even then, the US's image in the Middle East will remain that of an aggressor to be feared rather than a friend to be trusted. And with that, we reach the end of the semester. It has been a pleasure to have you in the class. Even though I wish I could have had more direct contact with you, I hope that what we have discussed over the course of the semester has helped you better understand the world we live in today. You are the future of this world, so make good use of what you know, both in your public and personal lives. Take care of yourself, and goodbye.